Good morning to you. I want to begin with just a short story. So Stephanie and I had dreams of an exotic, beach holiday for our 10-year anniversary. But given COVID happened, and so we had to kind of change our plans because between hard lockdowns and overseas travel restrictions, so we ended up settling for a really fancy holiday at a game lodge. I know it was rough, right? Throughout the scene, nah, that was a joke, but you didn't get it. But you're getting it now. No, it was really a lovely time at this game lodge. So when we had arrived, our personalized game ranger actually talked us through some of the things that we could expect or sign up for, and one of those was a bushwalk in the wild. And so neither Stephanie and I have ever done something like that. And so when we were offered it, we were like, I guess you only get to celebrate your 10-year anniversary once in your life, right? And so we signed up for it and teamed up with another couple and the ranger as well. And so they talk you through the whole protocol of these kind of bushwalks, but it's not something you really listen to. So I was like, yeah, blah, 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 yeah. I know how to walk, right? And so I wasn't paying any attention to it. Also, I kept thinking to myself, what is the worst thing that could ever happen out there, right? These rangers do this kind of stuff all the time. And so, kulungile, it's going to be smooth sailing from then on. Now, I've been on multiple game drives, and I've never felt afraid or intimidated from the comforts of the vehicle, right? But like all that changes for some reason. The moment you park the car for a bushwalk and the ranger says you step out. And so the moment your feet touch the soil in the middle of the wild, so I realized, perhaps this ain't such a bright idea. All right? And so the two rangers began to expand the route we were going to take, and they pointed to some kind of bushy sort of kind of areas there. And I was like, how are we going to see up ahead of us in those bushes? Right? But there was a plan, and so we lined up in single file, the two rangers up front, and then the rest of us would alternate our positions in the queue as we went along. And so I was chosen as the first guinea pig to stand right in front with the rangers as we are kind of walking, making our way through, and you're trying to be as quiet as possible because you do not want to startle any of the animals. When all of a sudden I hear the rangers in front, I go, yes! And they both turn back. And I turned back, and so in the whole confusion as they're turning in, I heard a grunt of some sort that I could not make out what it was, and the ground beneath us began to shake. And then as I looked over them, I saw a rhino galloping away from us. Right, just a few feet in front of us. Turns out we had walked straight into it and had startled it. And as it began to gallop away beyond us, I could have sworn I'd read its mind. As all of a sudden it stopped and began to turn around thinking, wait a minute, I'm bigger than these guys. And so stopped and started making noise and looking like it was about to charge, thinking, and this is my hood. What y'all doing in here, right? And I felt like saying, whoa, we can explain, right? As the rangers were like, start backing away slowly as we're backing away. And as I'm backing away, I found myself mumbling, nice little kitty. Now, why I would mumble that, God only knows, since I knew full well it wasn't a cat. But that's all I had at that moment, fun coming out my mouth. For some reason, they think didn't charge, and we got out of dodge. And so we found a spot where we got to just pause for a moment and just think about what had just happened. And then the ranger said to me, I told you things could get very real very fast out here. And I was like, yep, that's what you said, but I didn't realize it would get that real, right? And so for the rest of the trip, in the rest of our walk, your heart was in your mouth the whole time as you heard little noises everywhere, looking all around and start panicking. And so as nice and exciting as this thing sounded when we signed up for it, it turned out to be one of the biggest mistakes I've ever done in my life. In fact, afterwards, I swore never again would I ever go on a bushwalk in the wild. That stuff just ain't for me. I looked at even Stephanie and said, this was the biggest mistake of our lives I want to allow to have ever done. Now, perhaps, sometimes enough when you think about it, you've been in a situation where you were warned about certain dangers, but you didn't actually quite realize just how bad things were going to be once you found yourself in it. And so I mentioned COVID earlier. Do you remember those PCR tests, with COVID, where they would stick that thing up your nostril, right? Right. For those of you who had the wonderful, privilege of ever having one. And so it took me a long time before I ever had needed one. And then when I when I had mine and the nurse was sticking up, I was like, lady, chill. There's a brain up in there, right? And she kept on getting up there with a particular thing, right? Or perhaps some of you, have got the wonderful privilege of having children, and you were warned when you had kids that welcome to the tired years, but you were like, oh, please, right? That stuff ain't going to happen to me. I'm going to sleep train that baby like nobody's business, and sleepless nights ain't going to be my thing. And lekker, wasn't it? Right? And even as your kids are now growing up, and perhaps you're finding that equally true is this warning that people are giving you. And that is that, as your kids grow up, being a parent can be one of the most joyful experiences you could ever have. As you see them experience joys and success in life, and it feels like yours, right? But then equally, it can also be one of the most painful or difficult things you'll ever do in your life. Why? Because as you see your children go through certain failures and mistakes, those things can also start to feel like they're yours, right? Right? Causing you great pain as you see the consequences of their failures and mistakes play itself out in their lives. Or perhaps you're here this morning and people had warned you about a particular substance or a behavior, about its addictive nature, that you don't quite realize till now you find yourself having to wrestle through some of its negative effects and also dependency in your life. And so last week we began one of three messages in Genesis chapter 9, from verses 18 right through to Genesis 11, verse 26. A section in the book of Genesis that has got one overarching message to us. And it is a message that is looking to prepare us for what God will initiate in the story of Abram that is to come. And last week I talked about Genesis chapter 10 in the middle of it all, having two notable events that happens on either side of it. And so at the beginning in Genesis 9, 18 to 29, and then near the end at the Tower of Babel from the start of Genesis 11. Now, what I want to do this morning is focus on that first event, which I refer to as Noah's Puzzle Thursday, right? That happened. What do we see in that particular passage of text? We see Noah get drunk on wine, and then he lays naked in his tent. And then Ham, his youngest son, comes and discovers him. And instead of sort of kind of protecting his father's dignity, what he does is he makes a mockery of it to his brothers, Shem and Japheth. And then when Noah wakes and finds out what actually Ham had done to him, what Noah does then, he curses Ham's youngest son, Canaan. Now, as I just paraphrase that, I hope you're kind of getting a sense of like, sure, there's lots of drama happening in that particular story. But here's the thing, though. That drama had a cause to it. Particular cause. Something that had caused this. Something which God had warned Noah and his family about. But they didn't realize the seriousness of it until they found themselves caught up into it. And so God's warning to Noah and his family came way back in chapter 8, verses 1, when they exited the ark and Noah and his family sacrificed to God. And then God, here's how God responded, Genesis chapter 8, verse 21, and when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man, that's humanity, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither would I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done. Now, typical to Hebrew narratives, loves doing this, right? Hebrew narrative is that they love painting a beautiful, positive picture for you, right? And so lots of positivity happening in this particular text. So Noah and his family have just escaped this seismic judgment of God over humanity. And then immediately as they come out of the ark, they offer sacrifice. We find that God is taking great pleasure at their first actions after they've come out the ark. And then we know in the rest of chapter 9, God actually makes a covenant of grace towards them, to blessing them to go out and populate the whole earth. And yet, typical to the Hebrew narrative, you have all that positivity, but then the author does a little something. He leaves a hint of a little something in the text that will make you think or realize that perhaps things are not all sunshine and rainbows after the flood. And the pun was intended in that, right? And so look back at chapter 21 at this phrase that the author just leaves there by in God's words. I will never again curse the ground because of man. Why? For the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Evil from his youth. And so what is God saying? God is already saying, yeah, and there to them, that the very reason that had led him to judge the world like he had done back in chapter 6 had not gone away. It had not gone away. And so God was warning already back then to Noah and his family that the corruption of the human heart was not eradicated by the flood. He was warning. The corruption of the human heart was not eradicated by the flood, which then Genesis 9:18 to 29 circles back to and shows us just how. Right? Because when you read that story, verses 18 to 29 of Genesis chapter 9, you see the corruption, the wickedness of humanity evident and prevalent in that particular text. And so from Noah lacking the self-control in his indulgence with wine, to Ham, instead of honoring his parents, which would have been the cultural, and then later what God will call the people of Israel to do. Honor your father and your mother. That's not, fails at doing that. To even imagine the conflict, family conflict that would have arisen in a granddad cursing his own grandson in the hearing of the whole family. Think about that for a moment. Grandfather cursing his own grandson, wishing his own grandson ill at the hands of other relatives. Just imagine for a moment, grandma walking in on all that commotion, only to discover that granddad has cursed one of her little babies. Right? And so what's the picture that's being painted for us here by the author? He's painting the picture of a not-so-perfect family. Not so perfect family. And so the same Noah whom we were told earlier, who was righteous in his own generation, seems like he acts irrationally at what Ham had done and cursing his own grandson. And if you're Ham, if I think of myself about Ham, no matter what I may have done to you, but you go after my son in order to pay me back, then there's going to be big problems. And I don't care who you are. Right? And so the picture that's being painted here is a not so perfect family, and a family that has got its own corruption of heart that it will have to wrestle through. Now, the chapter 9, seems like it ends on a random note. Look at verses 28 to 29. After the flood, Noah lived 350 years. All the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. And so, what are we being told about this? Because if you think about this phrasing, right? This phrase, where else in the book of Genesis have we encountered that kind of similar phrasing? In the genealogy of Genesis chapter 5, that led from Adam right through to Noah. And when Mike spoke on this, on that genealogy a few weeks ago, what did we learn about that genealogy? That the first part that genealogy teaches us is what? That there's a pattern. There's a pattern of life and death as part of the consequences of the fall and sin. And so Genesis chapter 9 is actually ending on this note, that the corruption of the human heart that we see immediately occurring after the flood was not eradicated by the flood. And so therefore we ought to expect some patterns, similar patterns of brokenness and sinfulness repeat itself. And so if you think back even on the particular kind of action of that curse that Noah pronounces on Canaan, what was he actually ultimately doing? And so Bible commentators, Barnabé Asoto and Samuel Gwenya, write this. They said, this curse was another severe blow to family ties and the fellowship that the Creator intended for human beings. And already in Genesis, have we not seen the kind of murderous intent that family conflict can actually escalate to under the corruption of the human heart? And so it was not eradicated by the flood. And so this whole story ought to make us apprehensive about what is humanity's future prospects after the flood, if we ought to expect certain patterns of brokenness and sinfulness keep repeating itself. And so then as we move into Genesis chapter 10, with that apprehensiveness, thinking, what will we find in Genesis chapter 10? The author there again changes on us, actually surprises us with hope, gives us great hope. Because in Genesis chapter 10, the stable of nations, which I explained last week, what is it doing? It's trying to show us how the peoples, nations, cultures, and languages of the world all evolved over time through Noah and his sons. Here's the thing, not by accident, but by the blessing of God's covenant of grace which rested upon them. That's why they went on to populate the world, because God's blessing of his covenant of grace that he made and blessed them to go and multiply was resting upon them. That's why they were able to do it. Which is what Genesis chapter 10, verse 32 ends on this note, telling us precisely that Noah and his family went on to fulfill the blessing that God had extended to them. These are the clans of the sons of Noah according to their genealogies in their nations, and from these the nations spread abroad on the earth after the flood because of the covenant of grace of God that rested upon them. And so then what are we learning from Genesis chapter 10? It is teaching us this. It is teaching us that though humanity, the corruption of the human heart was not eradicated by the flood, Genesis 10 is telling us that the corruption of the human heart will not deter the faithfulness of God. That though you have fallen, broken people who are struggling with sin in their own lives, God would accomplish what he has determined, covenanted to do, despite their brokenness and sinfulness. Corruption of the human heart will not deter the faithfulness of God. For Noah and his family, that meant populating the world. And they were able to do so because God will remain faithful to his covenant, despite their brokenness and despite their sinfulness. Now, we believe here at BBC that every pages of our Bible points to or speaks of one ultimate purpose, and that is to lead us to find Jesus. Now, that does not mean that you will find Jesus explicitly mentioned on every page of the Bible. What that means is that when you take every page's collective message, it will be pointing you to Jesus Christ. Now, Genesis 9:18, straight through Genesis 11:26, does it as one unit. It's pointing us to Christ in one unit. And so for us to actually see that clearest, we'll have to actually come back to the story of the Tower of Babel and see how the whole story is trying to point us to Christ. But enough just for today to just end on a point of reflection. So as we consider the truths that we see in this particular story. And so if the corruption of the human heart was not eradicated by the flood, and if, despite that corruption, God's faithfulness was not deterred, but his blessing and covenant of grace brought about its purposes through fallen and broken people, then here's what the story is trying to tell us. It's telling us that Noah and his family needed to constantly wrestle with their unfallenness and brokenness, even as they went on to fulfill the purposes of God in their lives. That they would have to wrestle with that. But they will continuously have to work on that, even as they go on to fulfill the purposes of God. That they were wrestling with the corruption of their own heart did not mean that they hadn't experienced the grace of God over their life. In fact, they had received the salvation of God already. But here's what we're learning. We're learning that just because you've received the salvation of God by his grace does not exempt you from constantly needing to be transformed by that same grace. And so therefore, let's not just experience the salvation of God's grace without longing for its transformation of our hearts. That it will transform us at our heart. And so this morning, as we come to communion, and you'll find the communion elements in the seat pockets in front of you. As we come to communion, as people who will be here this morning, if you're a believer, saying, hey, I've experienced the grace of God, salvation over my life. As you come to the communion elements this morning, would you wrestle with God over where in your life are you needing for the transforming grace of God to transform your life and to transform your heart as one who has embraced the salvation of God?